Germany, Korea, Vietnam. Three nations, three cultures, three histories separated by thousands of kilometers. Yet all three shared one extraordinary fate. Each was divided into two, not by rivers, not by mountains, but by an invisible line between two ideas. Before we can understand why these countries were divided, we have to understand the two ideas that divided the entire world. One promised freedom, the other promised equality. Their collision would shape the 20th century. For most of the human history, people lived in small farming communities. Wealth came from land, kings ruled kingdoms, trade existed but it was limited. Then, beginning in Europe, something changed. Trade expanded across the oceans. Merchants grew richer than many nobles. Inventors built machines that could produce more goods than ever before. Factories transformed entire cities. This was the birth of modern capitalism. In 1776, a Scottish economist, Adam Smith, described a radical idea. If people were free to own property, start businesses, and compete in open markets, they would create wealth, not just for themselves, but for society as a whole. The pursuit of individual success, he argued, could make entire nations prosperous. Capitalism wasn't just an economic system, it was a belief that freedom and competition drive progress. And over the next century, it transformed Europe and America into industrial powers. Industrial cities grew rapidly, so did inequality. Factory owners accumulated enormous fortunes. Workers often labored 12 or 14 hours a day. Children worked in dangerous factories. Entire families lived in cramped neighborhoods while producing immense wealth for others. To many, capitalism looked less like freedom and more like exploitation. In the middle of the 19th century, a German philosopher named Karl Marx believed he had found the problem. He argued that capitalism was built on a simple contradiction. The people who owned factories became richer because workers produced more value than they were paid. As long as private ownership existed, inequality would continue to grow. Marx proposed a completely different vision. Factories, mines, and industries should belong to society, not private individuals. Production should serve everyone's needs rather than private profit. His dream was a classless society where wealth was shared instead of concentrated. For decades, these ideas remained mostly theoretical. Then, in 1917, history changed. Amid the chaos of the First World War, revolution swept through Russia. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, overthrew the old government and established the world's first communist state. For the first time, communism wasn't just an idea in a book, it governed one of the largest countries on earth. Now, two competing visions of society existed. One believed private enterprise created prosperity, the others believed collective ownership created justice. For a while, they coexisted uneasily. Then, the world descended into another catastrophe. World War II. And when the war ended, these two competing ideas would no longer remain confined to books or speeches. They would divide continents, they would divide alliances, and before long, they would divide entire nations. By 1945, the deadliest war in human history had finally ended. More than 60 million people had lost their lives. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Empires that had ruled the world for centuries lay exhausted. Before the war, the world's great powers were Britain, France, Germany, and Japan. But victory came at a terrible cost. Britain had won the war but was nearly bankrupt. France emerged liberated but was deeply weakened. Germany was defeated and occupied. Japan's empire had collapsed after two economic bombs and years of relentless bombing. For the first time in centuries, Europe was no longer the center of global power. Instead, two countries stood above all others. The United States had escaped the destruction of war on its own soil. Its factories had supplied weapons to the Allies. Its economy was booming. It possessed the world's strongest navy, the world's largest industrial base, and, for a brief moment, the only atomic bomb. Halfway across the world, another giant had emerged. The Soviet Union had suffered unimaginable losses. More than 27 million Soviet citizens had died defeating Nazi Germany. Entire cities had been destroyed, yet the Red Army had marched all the way to Berlin. The Soviet Union now controlled much of Eastern Europe. The war had left two victors. One represented capitalism, the other represented communism. During the war, they had fought side by side against Hitler, but they had never truly trusted one another. The United States feared that communism would spread across Europe. The Soviet Union feared that capitalist nations would one day try to destroy it, just as they had tried to isolate the communist revolution after 1917. Each side believed it was protecting the future, each believed the other threatened it. As wartime cooperation faded, suspicion took its place. And then the Cold War. Neither side wanted another world war. There was one overwhelming reason: nuclear weapons. A direct war between the United States and the Soviet Union could destroy not just armies but civilization itself. So instead of fighting each other directly, they fought in every other way. They built rival military alliances. The United States formed NATO. The Soviet Union later created the Warsaw Pact. They competed in science, in space, in intelligence, in propaganda. The armed allies funded governments, backed rebellions, overthrew unfriendly regimes. Every conflict around the world became a question: which side are you on? This long global confrontation became known as the Cold War. It was called cold because the two superpowers never fought each other directly. But for millions of peoples around the world, there was nothing cold about it. As Europe settled into two opposing blocs, the Cold War spread far beyond Europe, across Asia, Africa, Latin America. Countries emerging from colonial rule suddenly found themselves caught between two competing worlds. Some chose a side willingly, others had a side already chosen for them. And in three places, history created a perfect storm: Germany, Korea, Vietnam. Each had been occupied during or immediately after the Second World War. Each stood at the meeting point of American and Soviet power. And each was about to discover that when two superpowers refuse to back down, it is often the smaller nations that pay the price. The Cold War was global, but not every country was divided. Why these three? Why Germany, Korea, and Vietnam? The answer lies in a remarkable coincidence of history. At first glance, these countries couldn't be more different. Germany was Europe's industrial giant, Korea was an ancient kingdom in East Asia, while Vietnam was a Southeast Asian nation fighting for independence. Different continents, different cultures, different histories. Yet, by the end of the Second World War, all three found themselves in exactly the same position. Foreign armies stood on their soil, and those armies belonged to the world's two new superpowers. Germany had started the Second World War. When Nazi Germany surrendered in May 1945, there was no German government left. The victorious allies, the United States, Britain, France, and Soviet Union occupied the country. To administer Germany, they divided it into four occupation zones. The plan was meant to be temporary. No one imagined that these military zones would one day become international borders. But as relations between the allies collapsed, cooperation became impossible. Germany was no longer just a defeated nation, it had become the front line of the Cold War. Korea had a very different story. For centuries, it had existed as a single kingdom with one language, one culture, and one identity. But in 1910, Japan annexed Korea and ruled it as a colony for 35 years. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Korea was suddenly free. There was just one problem: Japanese forces still occupied the peninsula. Someone had to accept their surrender. American officials hurriedly proposed a line across the map, the 38th parallel. Soviet troops would accept the Japanese surrender in the north, American troops would do the same in the south. Like Germany, it was supposed to be temporary. Instead, it became the beginning of a permanent division. Now, Vietnam's path was different again. Unlike Germany or Korea, Vietnam wasn't simply emerging from occupation, it was trying to end colonial rule. For decades, Vietnam had been a part of the French colonial empire. During the Second World War, Japan occupied the region while allowing the French administration to remain. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Vietnamese nationalists led by Ho Chi Minh declared independence. But France was not ready to give up its colony. It returned to reclaim Vietnam. What began as a struggle for independence soon became something much larger. As the Cold War intensified, both the United States and the Soviet Union saw Vietnam not just as a colony, but as a battlefield in their own ideological struggle. Although their history was different, all three countries shared four crucial conditions. First, they had just emerged from war or foreign occupation. Their governments were weak or non existent. Second, foreign armies were already inside their borders. The United States and the Soviet Union did not need to invade, they were already there. Third, the future of each country was uncertain. There was no universally accepted government, no agreed political system, no clear path forward. And finally, the Cold War had just begun. Every political decision was now viewed through a single question: would this country become capitalist or communist? What might once have been local political disagreements became global strategic crisis. Temporary military arrangements hardened into political divisions, national struggles became international confrontations. The fate of these three nations would no longer be decided by their people alone. It would be shaped by Washington, Moscow, and by the rapidly growing distrust between them. The division of Germany, Korea, and Vietnam was not inevitable. It happened one decision at a time, one occupation, one negotiation, one election postponed, one border drawn. In 1945, Germany was divided into four occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. At first, the Allies hoped to rebuild Germany together. But as the Cold War deepened, cooperation collapsed. The Western powers merged their occupation zones and began rebuilding them with democratic institutions and economic aid through the Marshall Plan. The Soviet Union reorganized its zone under a communist government. In 1948, the Soviets blockaded West Berlin, hoping to force the Western allies out. Instead of retreating, the United States and its allies launched the Berlin airlift, flying food, fuel, and supplies into the city for almost a year. The blockade failed. The division became permanent. In 1949, two German states were born: West Germany and East Germany. For the next decade, millions of East Germans escaped to the West through Berlin. To stop the exodus, East Germany, backed by the Soviet Union, built the Berlin Wall in 1961, the wall that became the most powerful symbol of the Cold War. Germany had become a divided nation without a single shot being fired between the superpowers. Then Korea followed a far more violent path. Like Germany, it had been divided after 1945, but unlike Germany, both governments claimed to represent the entire country. On June 25th, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded the South. Within days, the Cold War turned into open war. The United Nations, led overwhelmingly by the United States, intervened to defend South Korea. North Korean forces were pushed back. Then UN troops advanced deep into North Korea. China feared that hostile forces on its border would threaten its security. Then hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers entered the war. The front lines swung back and forth across the peninsula. Cities were destroyed. Millions of civilians fled. After 3 years of brutal fighting, neither side could win. In 1953, an armistice ended the fighting, but it was not a peace treaty. The border remained almost exactly where it had begun. Technically, the Korean War has never ended. Then, Vietnam, the longest proxy war. Vietnam's story began as a struggle against colonialism. After declaring independence in 1945, Ho Chi Minh hoped the major powers would recognize a free Vietnam. Instead, France returned to restore its colonial rule. A war for independence followed. Ho Chi Minh's forces received growing support from China and the Soviet Union. France received support from the United States. In 1954, France suffered a decisive defeat at Dien Bien Phu. The Geneva Conference temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. National elections were supposed to reunify the country in 1956. Those elections never took place. The United Nations feared that Ho Chi Minh would win and that a communist Vietnam might encourage similar movements elsewhere in Asia. Instead, it backed the government in South Vietnam. What followed was one of the longest and most controversial wars of the 20th century. American involvement steadily escalated. At its peak, more than 500,000 American troops were fighting in Vietnam. Yet, military superiority could not overcome determined guerrilla resistance. After years of enormous human and economic cost, the United States withdrew. In 1975, North Vietnamese forces entered Saigon. Vietnam was reunited under a communist government. Looking back, the superpowers approached each country differently. In Germany, they accepted a tense military standoff. Neither side wanted to risk a direct confrontation in the heart of Europe. In Korea, both sides fought fiercely but stopped short of a total victory once the risk of a wider war became too great. In Vietnam, the conflict became a prolonged proxy war. The Soviet Union and China supplied the North, the United States fought alongside the South. The superpowers rarely faced each other directly. Instead, millions of Germans, Koreans, and Vietnamese lived with the consequences of their rivalry. By the mid 1970s, all three stories had reached very different places. Germany remained divided behind a concrete wall, Korea remained divided behind a heavily armed border, Vietnam had become one nation again. How could three countries caught in the same world war end up with such different futures? The answer lies not only in the actions of the superpowers, but in the histories of the nations themselves. The Cold War divided Germany, Korea, and Vietnam in remarkably similar ways, but history did not end the same way for all three. One nation united peacefully, one reunited through war, and one remains divided to this day. Why? First of all, for Germany. For 40 years, Germany remained the symbolic frontier of the Cold War. West Germany became one of the world's strongest economies, supported by democratic institutions and close ties with Western Europe. East Germany remained under Soviet influence, with a centrally planned economy and tight political control. Yet, despite 4 decades of separation, Germans on both sides still saw themselves as one people. They shared the same language, same history, same national identity. The wall divided a country, but it never erased the idea of Germany. Then, in the late 1980s, the Soviet Union began to weaken. Communist governments across Eastern Europe started to collapse. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Less than a year later, Germany reunited peacefully. Not because one side defeated the other, but because the geopolitical force that had divided Germany disappeared. Now, Korea also began as one nation. For centuries, it shared a common culture, language, identity. But unlike Germany, the Cold War did not end on the Korean peninsula. After the Korean War, North and South Korea followed completely different paths. So, South Korea became a democracy with one of the world's most advanced economies. North Korea became one of the world's most isolated and authoritarian states. Over 70 years, two generations grew up under entirely different political systems. Today, the two Koreans remain separated not only by a border, but by decades of different experiences, economies, and worldviews. Both still speak the same language, both still share a common history, but the cost of division has grown with every passing decade. Vietnam's outcome was very different from both Germany and Korea. Communism certainly mattered, but it wasn't the only force shaping Vietnam's future. Long before the Cold War, Vietnamese people had spent centuries resisting foreign domination. First Chinese rule, then French colonialism, then Japanese occupation. For many Vietnamese, the struggle was never simply about communism, it was about independence. Ho Chi Minh understood this. He presented himself not only as a communist leader, but as the leader of a national liberation movement. By the time the United States withdrew, the North had achieved both military victory and the nationalist goal of reunifying the country. In 1975, Vietnam became one country again. Its reunification came not through negotiation, but through victory on the battlefield. At first, the stories seem almost identical. Each nation was divided after a major war, each became part of the Cold War, each became a contest between communism and capitalism. But beneath those similarities lay important differences. In Germany, division depended almost almost entirely on the survival of the Cold War. When the Soviet Union weakened, reunification became possible. In Korea, neither side achieved a decisive military victory. The balance of power hardened into a permanent stalemate. And in Vietnam, one side ultimately won the war before the Cold War itself had ended. The same global conflict produced three different endings because each nation carried a different history, faced different military realities, and inspired very different forms of nationalism. The Cold War appears as a struggle between two superpowers, but for millions of ordinary people, it was something much more personal. Families separated, cities divided, wars fought, lives transformed. Germany reminds us what political walls can fall. Vietnam shows that foreign intervention cannot always overcome national identity, and Korea stands as a reminder that some chapters of history remain unfinished. In the end, the Cold War did not simply divide nations, it collided with histories that had begun centuries earlier. And when that collision ended, Germany found unity, Vietnam found victory, Korea was left divergent and waiting. History is shaped not only by great powers, but apparently by the nations caught between them.